The moment before everything changed, my stepmother looked completely confident. She sat in the courtroom with a satisfied smile, as if the judge's decision had already been made. Without even trying to lower her voice, she looked toward the relatives, sitting behind her, and said, "Without this family, she would have nothing." Several people laughed. Some shook their heads in agreement. Others looked at me with quiet pity, convinced I was about to lose everything my father had left behind. I didn't react. I simply remained seated in my army dress uniform, my hands resting, calmly in my lap. They believed they already knew my story. To them, I was the daughter who had spent most of her adult life away from home, the soldier who always seemed too busy for family, the woman who knew nothing about estates, trusts, or courtrooms. They saw my uniform, but they had no idea what stood behind. What none of them noticed was Judge Rowan. He had stopped reading. His eyes remained fixed on a single page buried deep inside the court file. Page 14. He read it once. Then again. The silence in the courtroom slowly became uncomfortable. No one understood why he hadn't continued. No one except me. My name is Elise Cross. For 17 years, silence became one of the most valuable lessons my military career ever taught me. Silence allows people to reveal exactly who they are. During military briefings, I had watched experienced officers mistake me for an assistant before I spoke a single word. At family gatherings, relatives introduced me as someone with a steady government job. My stepmother, Vivian, loved saying that. She spoke about my career as though I spent my days pushing paperwork instead of serving my country. I never corrected her, because people who underestimate you often expose far more than those who understand. No one ever asked how I earned a law degree while serving overseas. No. One wondered why I spent weekends studying legal cases between deployments, and nobody outside a handful of military colleagues knew that I had spent years serving in the Judge Advocate General's Corps Reserve. To them, I was simply the quiet daughter, but one person knew the truth. My father. He knew exactly who I was. More importantly, he trusted me. That trust began years before his passing. Whenever he updated his estate plans, he never relied on strangers alone. He asked me to review every document personally, every amendment, every clause, every signature, not because I was his daughter, because I was someone whose judgment he believed in completely. 3 months before this hearing, my father passed away quietly in his study. The phone call reached me while I was still on active assignment. I returned home as quickly as military travel would allow. But by the time I arrived in Richmond, everything had already changed. The locks on the family home had been replaced. Vivian answered the door only long enough to tell me I wasn't welcome inside. She refused to give me my father's journals. She refused to hand over family records, even the letters my late mother had written. Decades earlier were treated like they meant nothing. The next morning, I found cardboard boxes sitting outside the house. Rain had soaked through them overnight. Inside were my childhood photographs, old report cards, birthday cards, letters from my mother. Some pages had already begun sticking together because of the water. I carefully picked them up one by one, not because they were valuable, because they were irreplaceable. When I questioned Vivian about it, several relatives immediately defended her. "Don't make this harder than it already is. Your father wouldn't want conflict, protect the peace." I listened quietly, then I carried every damaged box back to my hotel room. Because while everyone else was trying to protect appearances, I had decided to protect something far more important: the truth. That same evening, I made a phone call, not to another family member, not to argue, not to negotiate. I called Nora Bennett, an estate attorney and an old friend from law school. Unlike everyone else, Nora didn't ask how I was feeling. She asked one simple question: "What documents do you already have?" For the next several hours, we built a timeline. Property records, trust agreements, investment histories, bank statements, everything connected to my father's estate. The more records we gathered, the more one thing became painfully clear. Vivian wasn't simply managing the estate. She had already started dismantling it, and she believed no one would ever discover how. That night, the hotel room became my temporary command center. While most of my relatives gathered at the family home, comforting Vivian and discussing the future of the estate, I sat surrounded by stacks of documents, legal files, and my laptop. Nora Bennett arrived just before sunset carrying 2 large folders. She placed them on the table without saying a word. Then she looked at me. "I've reviewed everything you sent." Her expression was serious. "Something doesn't add up." For the next several hours, we examined every record connected to my father's estate. Property deeds, investment accounts, trust agreements, vehicle registrations, tax filings, every signature, every transfer, every date. The more we looked, the more uncomfortable the picture became. Vivian hadn't simply taken control of the estate after my father's passing. She had started making permanent financial decisions almost immediately. One document showed that my father's fully restored classic Mustang had already been sold to a private collector. Another revealed 2 valuable paintings had been removed from the family collection and auctioned. Investment statements showed that thousands of shares had quietly been transferred into Vivian's personal account. Each transaction looked legitimate on the surface. Each document carried the proper signatures. Each sale appeared carefully organized. But there was one problem. None of those assets actually belonged to Vivian. She believed becoming trustee meant becoming owner. Those are 2 very different things. Nora leaned back in her chair. She thinks the trust gives her unlimited authority. I nodded. She never understood what Dad was trying to protect. Years earlier, my father and I had spent countless evenings discussing his estate plan. He wasn't worried about taxes. He wasn't worried about complicated legal language. He worried about people changing after grief, and money entered the picture. He once told me something I never forgot. Money doesn't change character, it reveals it. Because of that belief, he insisted every major decision includes safeguards. One safeguard mattered more than all the others. Section 14. I remembered helping him review the wording late one evening. Every sentence had been written carefully. Every possibility considered. If the trustee ever sold principal trust assets without proper authorization, control of the entire trust would immediately transfer to the successor trustee. There would be no warning. No second chance, no lengthy approval process. The transfer would happen automatically. The successor trustee was me. Nora closed the folder and smiled for the first time that evening. I don't think Vivian has ever read this section. I don't think so either. She suggested we reveal my legal background before the hearing. It would strengthen our position immediately. But I shook my head. No, she looked surprised. You want them to keep believing you're just the daughter? Exactly. For years, people had underestimated me. I had learned something valuable because of it. People reveal their true intentions when they believe you don't understand what's happening. If Vivian believed I knew nothing about trust law, she would continue speaking freely. She would make assumptions. She would place those assumptions on the official court record, and once those statements were made under oath, they couldn't simply be taken back. The morning of the hearing arrived. The courtroom slowly filled with relatives, attorneys, and observers. Vivian entered wearing black, carrying herself with complete confidence. She smiled at family members before taking her seat. Grant Mercer, her attorney, appeared equally relaxed. From the beginning, he controlled the room with confidence. He described me as a distant daughter, someone who spent more time serving overseas than caring for family matters, someone unfamiliar with estate planning, someone suddenly interested in money only after my father's death. Each sentence painted the same picture, an absent daughter looking for an inheritance she hadn't earned. Vivian then took the witness stand. Her voice never shook. She confidently testified that my father had always handled financial matters himself. She claimed I had never participated in estate planning, never reviewed legal documents, never discussed the trust. According to Vivian, I knew nothing. Several relatives quietly nodded. Everything was unfolding exactly as I expected. I remained completely silent, not because I lacked answers, because the truth doesn't become stronger by interrupting a lie. It becomes stronger when the lie finishes speaking. Finally, Grant ended his examination. He looked satisfied. Vivian smiled as she stepped down from the witness stand. The courtroom became still. Judge Rowan adjusted his glasses. He slowly reached for another group of documents. Then, he stopped. His attention settled on a single page buried deep inside the court file. Page 14. He studied it carefully. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. Then the judge looked directly toward me. Major Cross. Every conversation inside the courtroom stopped. You may please stand. I rose calmly. The judge folded his hands. Counsel has argued repeatedly that you lack the education and experience necessary to oversee this trust. He paused. However, he lifted another document. Court records tell a very different story. Across the room, Grant's confident expression disappeared. Vivian slowly turned toward me. Neither of them had any idea. Their entire case was about to collapse. Judge Rowan held the document in his hands for several quiet seconds. No one spoke. The courtroom, which had been filled with confident whispers only moments earlier, suddenly felt frozen. Then the judge looked directly at Grant Mercer. "Counsel," he said calmly, "you've argued that Major Cross lacks the knowledge and experience to administer this trust." Grant nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Rowan raised another file. "Then perhaps you should explain why the court records identify Major Elise Cross as a licensed attorney, admitted to the bar 6 years ago." A wave of silence swept across the room. Grant's expression changed instantly. He turned toward me as if seeing me for the first time. Vivian's face lost all color. She stared at my uniform, then back at the judge. "No," she whispered. "That can't be right." Judge Rowan continued without emotion. "It is also documented that Major Cross serves in the Judge Advocate General's Corps Reserve and personally reviewed multiple amendments to the Cross Family Trust." Every relative sitting behind Vivian looked at one another in disbelief. The woman they had dismissed as an inexperienced soldier had quietly helped build the very legal document they were now fighting over. Grant quickly stood. "Your Honor, I respectfully request a short recess." Judge Rowan shook his head. "Denied. There is one more matter the court must address." The courtroom clerk placed a sealed envelope on the bench. Even from where I stood, I recognized my father's handwriting. For the first time that entire day, my composure nearly broke. The judge carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter my father had instructed the court to keep sealed unless the administration of his estate was ever challenged. Judge Rowan adjusted his glasses and began reading. "If this letter has been opened, then the trust I created has become the subject of dispute." The room remained completely silent. "My wife, Vivian, was always intended to live comfortably in our home. She deserves security and peace for the rest of her life." Vivian lowered her eyes. "However, the assets placed inside this trust were never intended to become personal property. No vehicle, artwork, investment, or principal asset may be sold, transferred, or gifted without the written approval of my daughter, Elise." Grant slowly lowered his head. The judge continued reading. "I chose Elise because she has never asked me for money. She asked only for honesty." My throat tightened. The final paragraph was short, but every word carried weight. "If Vivian ever violates these instructions, authority over this trust shall immediately and permanently transfer to Elise Cross. That decision is final." The judge folded the letter, then he looked directly at Vivian. "The court finds that unauthorized sales and transfers have occurred. The conditions described in Section 14 have been activated, effective immediately. Major Elise Cross is now the lawful trustee of the Cross Family Trust." A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Grant quietly closed his briefcase. He already knew the case was over. Judge Rowan continued reading the orders. The sale of the Mustang. Void. The auction of the paintings. Reversed. The investment shares. Returned to the trust immediately. Any financial losses caused by the unauthorized transactions would be repaid in full. Administrative authority transferred to me before the hearing even ended. When the judge struck the gavel, months of uncertainty disappeared in a single sound. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited on the front steps. Relatives slowly walked past me without saying a word. The same people who had laughed before the hearing now refused to meet my eyes. Vivian finally approached. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly said, "I never knew who you really were." I looked at her calmly. "You never wanted to know." Tears filled her eyes. "I thought you hated this family?" I gently shook my head. "I never hated anyone. I simply respected my father's wishes." She looked toward the courthouse doors. "I've lost everything?" "No," I answered softly. "You've lost control. There's a difference. My father wanted you protected. And that's exactly what will happen. You'll keep living in the house. You'll continue receiving every benefit he planned for you. But from now on, every decision follows the trust. Nothing more, nothing less." Vivian nodded slowly. For the first time, there was no anger between us. Only acceptance. Over the next several days, everything my father had worked to build slowly returned. The collector agreed to reverse the sale of the restored Mustang. The paintings were recovered and brought back to the family home. The missing investment shares were restored. Every dividend was accounted for. Every financial record was corrected. Vivian signed a complete accounting agreement and voluntarily stepped away from managing the estate. A week later, she handed me a small cardboard box. Inside were my father's journals, exactly where he had left them. That evening, I drove alone to the cemetery. The air was quiet. The sun was beginning to disappear beyond the trees. I sat beside my father's grave and opened the final journal. Near the last few pages, I found an entry written only weeks before his passing. It read, "Let people underestimate you. The truth carries far more weight when it arrives without warning." I closed the journal slowly. For months, I believed I had been fighting to protect property, the house, the investments, the family trust. But sitting there beside my father's grave, I finally understood. The greatest inheritance he left me wasn't financial. It was something far more valuable. He believed in me long before anyone else ever did. He saw my strength when others only saw my silence. And because of that, I no longer needed to explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. The truth had done its job. It never shouted. It never argued. It simply entered the courtroom, opened one forgotten file, and ended the conversation forever.